I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing, and there are now and there have always been numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel unto the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Techia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, an Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I'd hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism, and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism, hermetic philosophy, by joining my Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. So, let's do a little recap. I hope you had the chance to take a look at the episode on Merkava or Hechalot mysticism. And so, in order to recap a bit, what I want to do is take a look at those mysticisms just briefly, because in some ways they're going to link us to the topic we're going to be dealing with this evening, and that is the topic of Jewish magic. As you may remember, the apocalyptic mode of Judaism produced a novel religious way of being, but the proto-rabbinic circles, the early rabbis, did not like apocalyptic Judaism for lots of reasons, one of which is that it seemed to encourage a kind of bellicose, warlike behavior, and it seemed to commit people to a kind of determinism. And determinism, as you might imagine, doesn't really inspire people to be better. It just says, accept your fate and go on with it. It's all part of the divine plan. Well, the early rabbis really didn't like that idea. They really thought, no, we can choose to live differently than we're living. We can choose a different world. And that emphasis on choice and moral responsibility on the part of the rabbis really tilted rabbinical Judaism away from, although not completely away from, many of the central tenets of apocalyptic Judaism. Now, what does emerge in the world of apocalyptic Judaism is a new kind of mysticism that, ironically enough, does actually prove to be popular, at least with some rabbis. Now, I don't want to paint a wide brush or paint with a broad brush and say, yes, all of Merkava and Shir Koma mysticisms were popular among the rabbinical elite. That's definitely not true. If you know anything about rabbis, one of the things that rabbis do as a hobby is disagree with one another. So there's just no evidence to say that the rabbis were terribly interested in all practicing these forms of mysticism. And just to parse those out a bit, as to maybe jog your memory, the Hechalot or Merkava literature or mysticism is a form of mysticism in which the mystic descends into the divine palaces, and they have to bypass all kinds of angelic guardians, and they have to give them passcodes, and they have to give them secret handshakes and decoder rings, and not really decoder rings, but all this kind of weird stuff. And by doing that, they eventually descend through the various palaces of God and ultimately arrive with a what we would now call a beatific vision, which is to say they are allowed to gaze upon the throne of God. In some of this literature, they're allowed to sit upon the throne of God, which I always imagine like remember when you were a little kid and you would sit in the big kid chair, and you would sit in like the big people tape like chair, and you would be like real small sitting in a giant recliner. I kind of always imagine that's what it's like to sit in the throne of God. It's like a really worn out, like gritty recliner that's super comfortable that your like granddad sat in for 50 years. That's what I imagine to be the throne of God. So you can sit in the throne of God, and sometimes you can be transformed into an angel. Why you want to do that, I don't know, but you could, right? And Enoch, of course, is the quintessential version of someone who, according to one of the books of Enoch, is transformed into an angel. Alternatively, you could do the nerd option, and the nerd option is math. And the nerd option includes gazing upon the divine body and measuring it, right? And you measure it in this parasang Persian unit, 3.5 miles, and you're allowed to learn the secret names of all the different parts of God's body, his left eyebrow and right eyebrow and left ear and right ear and all these things. And you're allowed to measure the parts of the divine body. And these numbers may have been something like a meditative technique, although we really don't know. It's just a very bizarre form of literature, very strange form of mysticism. Although I will say, as I pointed out last time, that Maimonides actually might be arguing against the Merkava Shior Koma literature in the Guide to the Perplexed. That might be the target, at least, of some of his analysis in the Guide to the Perplexed. Which, by the way, just to drive that point home, if that's the case, and I think Menachem Kellner makes a really great case that it is, that means the greatest work in all of the history of Jewish philosophy is a response to a form of Jewish mysticism, right? It's downstream of it's a reaction to Jewish mysticism. And I think that can't be underestimated and underplayed. I think that's incredibly important if it's true. And I happen to believe that it is true, at least to some degree. The other form of literature that we talked about, or mysticism, is what is called the Sar Torah mysticism, the Prince of the Torah. And this is a para-rabbinic. We think that these guys may have been in rabbinic circles, but maybe on the outside of rabbinic circles, not quite the inner core, but maybe kind of the hipsters outside smoking cigarettes in the dive bar where the rabbis hung out. These guys wanted to summon a kind of angel called the Sar Torah, the Prince of the Torah. And this angel would teach them rabbinic lore, laws, and secrets very rapidly. I don't know. This is like the person that comes to you the day of the exam, who's a C student, and asks if they can see your notes, and they try to download all your notes the day before the exam, right? It's like, they're that guy. And so what do? They have to go before the rabbinical elites, and they have to figure all this stuff out. And they're like, well, might as well summon an angel. And one can hope that the angel will help them with their rabbi test or their calculus test or their German test or whatever test they had to take. I will say, however, that if I could just learn the liberal arts by summoning an angel, I would have done that. And so clearly I didn't. Just as a last thing to remind folks, dozens of these manuscripts survive. Dozens, right? And history is a bad place. History is a dangerous place. It's a vicious place. Very little survives, right? When you write a book down on papyrus in Egypt, the odds of it surviving anywhere outside of Egypt are pretty low. And so we have dozens of examples of these texts surviving, being transmitted into Europe, surviving into the Middle Ages, in the world of the Chashdei Ashkenaz, for instance, the world of the German pietists, who we'll get to later. These manuscripts survived, which means at some level they were popular, they were copied, they were probably practiced. So we see them being used over and over again. We see elements of the Hechalot literature appearing, for instance, in the Talmud. We also see elements of the Hechalot literature appearing in the New Testament, which I don't have to remind you, is a Jewish text written by Jewish people, right? So the New Testament also contains some mentions of Hechalot literature, which is just to say that all of this is a witness to the popularity of these forms of mysticism and what might be called quasi-magic. And I say quasi-magic because the Sar Torah literature is a kind of quasi-magic, right? It is a kind of quasi-magic. And when I say quasi-magic, you are in fact summoning a being, right? You're in fact summoning a being to, to magically teach you stuff rapidly, right? You can't learn things rapidly normally. You have to download them somehow, right? Almost like putting a jack in your head and like downloading the information. The Sar Torah somehow has the ability to do that for you. So this is a bit of a recap that gets us up to speed and links for us, at least at some level, the distinction between Merkava mysticism, where you descend into the chariot, to the Sartora literature, in which you're bringing down an angel. And that bridges the gap for us at some level between mysticism and magic. And those two things are where we're going to move tonight. We're going to move in the direction of Jewish magic. So just 1 second, I'm getting a bunch of emails, which tells me that there might be something amiss. So let me see, just check those real fast and before we jump right in, because I want to make sure that I'm not missing something in the wrong room or whatever. So 1 second, folks. Sorry again. No. Okay, we're good. Great. When I hear like 5 emails go off all of a sudden randomly, it's better just to check and make sure I'm not in the wrong room or some other kind of mistake. All right, folks, let's turn to Jewish magic. Now, as you might imagine, magic and Jewish magic more specifically present a lot of complex problems, right? They present a lot of complex problems. The first problem is that the term magic and the concept of magic is basically impossible to pin down. Scholars have been trying to pin down what exactly one means by magic for a couple of 100 years, maybe more than that, really more than that. Because the problem with magic is, where does magic end and where does religion begin, right? It seems like magic is causing things by supernatural means. Well, what about prayer, right? That seems like a kind of supernatural causation, right? So magic is always a term that's very difficult to pin down exactly what we mean by it. And just to give you some evidence of that, this is a recent volume called Defining Magic here, right? Defining Magic, and it's about 260 pages, pretty dense academic literature of about 30 or 40 different scholars trying to do just that. And guess what? They don't. They all agree that you can't. So scholars even today are throwing ink at trying to figure out what exactly magic is, and it's a difficult task. Now, what I'm going to say, right, is for the purposes of this lecture at least, I'm just going to mean magic to mean any illicit supernatural practice, right? Any illicit supernatural practice. Now, why do I say illicit? Because magic in history has almost always been used as a way of othering someone else's practices. So, for instance, when the Greeks decided that they did religion, they othered the Persians and they said, the Magi, they do weird Persian religion, right? We do theurgy, we do real religion, but those Persians, they do magic, right? They are magic users. So, right, ditto, right, with the witches, right? When the Catholic Church did miracles, the Catholic Church said, yeah, we do miracles. But what do witches do? Oh, they do magic. They do witchcraft. So you can see here, right, that the lines we draw about what's magic and what's not, what's a miracle and what's not, what's sorcery and what's legitimate religion, the line has less to do with what you're doing. It has more to do with who's in control and who gets to decide what's allowed and what's not. So magic in this case is almost always an othering term. It's almost always used to describe what the other does, the bad people, the women, the Persians, the Jews, whatever. So it's an othering term. So when I use it here, right, I want to be clear about two things. One, I'm using it in a very circumspect way. And two, I want to acknowledge that for many people now in the 20th and 21st century, magic is an important part of their spiritual life. Modern day Wicca, modern day people who identify as witches, modern day Druids, modern day Jewish people who practice magic as part of their spirituality is a fundamentally different kind of thing than what I'm talking about tonight. So I just want to say that what I'm doing here is putting magic in a very specific, circumspect way in order to elucidate how it's operated within Judaism over the course of several millennia. I am not offering a end-all, be-all definition of magic because you can't. You can't. it's much more problematic than that. Secondly, Jewish magic is a mess because it seems like a contradiction in terms. Why? Well, if the authorities determine what's in and what's out, what's licit and what's illicit, well, the problem here is, what does the Torah say about these practices? Well, the Torah is really weird about this. Now, I know that you probably have in your mind the idea that the Torah condemns magic. And the answer to that is kinda it does. It depends on what you mean by magic. So the most extensive condemnation that we see in the Torah of what we would now consider something like magic is actually probably in Deuteronomy 18. Now, there are lots of other places in the Hebrew Bible where magic or something like magic is condemned. There are practices or really people that do certain kinds of things that are condemned. But you'll see here, right? And I've left the technical terms in the original Hebrew transliterated here. So it reads in Deuteronomy 18, there won't be found among you one who passes his son and daughter through the fire. This is probably an indigenous Canaanite practice. A kosim of kosamim, a me'onin, a menachesh, a mechashef, and a chover of chever, and one who asks of an ov or a yedaoni, and the one who seeks the dead, doresh metim, right? Now, what you see here, right, is that I've maintained all those Hebrew words in their transliterated form. Why? Because we don't know what any of them are, really. We don't know what any of them are. All right, a me'onin might have to do with someone who divines things, tells the future through clouds, right? The Hebrew word anan does mean cloud. So maybe it's one who clouds stuff, right? But what they do, we have no idea. A mechashef, right? This might come from the word, for snake, right? A nachash, right? This might come from someone who divines things from snakes, but again, we don't know. A Baal and a Yedaoni, again, we don't know. And not only do we not know, the rabbis of the earliest period of the Talmud didn't know either. And how do we know that? They debated about what these words meant. You don't debate about what words mean if everyone already knows what they mean. You debate about them when you don't know what they are. And so what we see, for instance, in Tractate Sanhedrin and the Babylonian Talmud is a very elaborate debate about what's allowed and what's not. What's supernatural causation that's allowed and what's supernatural causation which is usser, which is forbidden. Now, of course, the most famous combination in the Hebrew Bible is found in the book of Exodus. And that line, and I have to say, this line, mechashefa lo techaye, that line cost the lives, I would say, of thousands, tens of thousands of people in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period, specifically women. This famous line reads, mechashefa lo techaye, female magic doing person, don't let them live. Right? That's literally, and of course you probably know it more famously in the King James Bible translation, suffer not a witch to live, right? That line led thousands, tens of thousands of women to their death in the early modern period during the witch hunts. We think that number is somewhere between 40 and 60,000 people, mostly women, were executed during the witch hunts. And that line, justified, they leaned heavily on that line, right? Because it's so brief and so terribly profound. Now, of course, we have this line, mechashefa lo techaye. By the way, you'll notice for folks who understand some Hebrew, it's in the feminine form, right? It's specifically targeting women. We do see other texts like mechashef, right? The masculine form over there in the book of Deuteronomy, right? Deuteronomy, you can see it there. So it does condemn both female and male magic users, but the line in Exodus specifically targets women. So at any rate, what do we do with this machashefa lo techaye, right? That you can't let witches or female sorcerers or whatever live. Well, you can contrast it with other sections of the Hebrew Bible which seem perfectly at home with supernatural causation. The two most famous examples are divination. You're perfectly allowed to use divination in the Hebrew Bible. You just have to use a specific form of divination. This is to say the breastplate of the high priest has a device in it called the Urim Thummim. The Urim and the Thummim, right? This is some kind of divination device, although exactly how it worked, we don't know. There's a lot of speculation about this in the Talmud. If when I say it worked, I mean, who knows what it really was. And of course, the other more infamous ritual is the Sotah ritual, in which a woman suspected of adultery, notice there's no male version of the Sotah ritual, there's no men suspected of adultery who have to endure this, in which a woman is forced to consume a broth made of sand and ash and things and drink this, and assuming that she's committed adultery, it would cause her stomach to become upset, and she would be executed. So the Sotah ritual, right, is also a form of supernatural causation to sort out whether or not a woman has committed adultery. These are both examples of supernatural causation that are allowed in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, there's an entire tractate of the Babylonian Talmud dedicated to the Sotah ritual. So it's clear that these forms of supernatural causation are illicit, while the other ones, right, being a me'onin or a menachesh, those are forbidden. So what do these words mean? We don't know. We do, however, get some clues, right? One of the great boons of 20th century archaeology was that we figured out how to read Akkadian. Akkadian is the language of the ancient Babylonians. It's a distant cousin of Hebrew. And guess what we find there? We find cognates. And cognates are the jam of any linguist, right? Because if you can find a cognate in German and Old Gothic, right? And if you don't know what the Gothic means, you might be able to figure out from the Middle High German what the Old Gothic word might mean. And it's just fantastic. This is a great thing. So ditto, right? We find the Akkadian word, for instance, kishpu, which does mean evil magic doer. And look at that, right? Look, we find, right, with the word machashefa, right? We can see, if you know some Hebrew, right, you can see the exact same root word, right? The ka, the sha, right? And the pu sound, of course, is unique to Akkadian. We can see there in Akkadian that we have a very clear word for sorcerer, magic doer. This is important, by the way, because if you read the Septuagint, of course, is the Greek translation of the Bible, Hebrew Bible, into Greek. The Septuagint actually translates the word machashefa as poisoner, pharmakeia, right? It translates it as poisoner. So they kind of up-translate it to make it a bit more rational, but it's very clear from the original Hebrew that the word does, in fact, indicate a specifically female magic doer person. That's a really, really bad translation, but you get the drift from the Akkadian word kishbu. Now, does the Torah condemn all magic? As we've seen, kinda not. It depends on what you mean by magic. You may remember this is image here from one of our first lectures here on Jewish mysticism. This is the Ketef Hinnom amulet that was found in a grave in Jerusalem. Well, why might you put the priestly benediction in a grave? Well, you might put it in a grave for magical purposes, to protect the dead from things like evil spirits. Why? Because we see that kind of practice occurring all over the ancient Near East. Again, the Israelites are an ancient Near Eastern people, and they mimic, they incorporate practices from the wider Near East. And so when you see an amulet written on silver with blessings on it, the natural leap is that this document is some kind of amulet to protect the dead, perhaps from evil spirits. Well, if that's true, and I think there's good reason to believe that it is, that makes the earliest section of the Hebrew Bible ever recovered an amulet, and therefore a magical object. Now, just let that settle in for a moment. That would mean that the earliest example of the Hebrew Bible that has ever been recovered is a magical device. I think that's profound when thinking about the history of magic. That means magic predates, at least in terms of material culture, everything else we know about the Hebrew Bible. And I find that to be profoundly interesting, right? Profoundly interesting. Now, does that mean that the people that put those amulets in those tombs were allowed to do that? Does that mean that they were operating within the normal limits of what was acceptable at the time? No, we have no idea. But what we do have is the material history, and we have to deal with it as such, right? It's not for me to judge yay or nay. All I can say is someone wrote a blessing that eventually became part of the Hebrew Bible on a silver amulet and put it in a tomb. And anywhere else we would see something like that, we would jump to the idea they were doing magic. Why not just let that evidence speak for itself at some level? So it's clear, right, that what the Hebrew Bible is worried about, what the Israelites are worried about when they condemn magic, is less practices. They're worried about differentiating themselves from their neighbors, right? These people do this, we don't do that, right? These people do this, we don't do that either, right? These people do these practices, and we don't want those kinds of people in our community. So notice that the condemnations here in Deuteronomy, they're about being people. Don't be a kesamim. Don't be a me'onin. Don't be a minachesh, right? Don't be a chover of chever. Don't be a person that does that. It's not a condemnation of the practice per se. It's a condemnation of those kinds of people being in your community. And as we'll see in just a minute, right, many Israelites, at least one Israelite, a very famous one, had to consult with one of those people. So again, what the condemnations we see here are not condemnations of practice typically, they're condemnations of people doing those practices. Why? Probably identity formation. We're not those people. We're not those kind of people. But also, it's theologically threatening. If you're moving in the direction of monotheism, right? If monotheism is in your wheelhouse and you're moving in the idea that there's a singular God who does everything in the world, well, what does it mean if there's like Menachem down the road or Chava down the road and they can like monkey around with reality and like bring people back to life or curse crops or make people fall in love with each other? It seems like they have access to supernatural powers over and against the supernatural powers of your God. And that's worrying. That's a theological worry. Because if your God is the only God and the only one really in control, who are these people? And what are they tapping into? How do they have access to these weird powers where they can make someone fall in love with someone else or make someone get a sickness or cure a disease or bring someone back from the dead? That's all very anxiety producing. If monotheism, a strict kind of monotheism, is ultimately where you're going, where God and God alone has those kinds of powers. And of course, you'll see that same anxiety play itself out later in, for instance, Christianity, but Christianity has an easy answer for that. Their answer is they're working with the damn devil, right? And if they're working with the devil, that's how they do this stuff. The Israelites, at least the Israelites, once they've adopted monotheism, don't have that answer, right? And so this is a much more complicated problem for them, at least at this point, prior to the apocalyptic. Then later on, fallen angels will teach people all kinds of bad stuff, as you can see early on in the book of Enoch. The clearest account of magical practice among the Israelites is to be found, of course, in the Hebrew Bible, because where else would it be found? And that account, of course, was to be found in the story of the Baalat Ov. You'll notice here, right, that we have that prohibition on consulting an Ov or being an Ov back in Deuteronomy. But here we have a person with a title, Baalat Ov. We don't know her name, but we do know her title. She is a mistress of the Ov. Now, Baalat is relatively clear. It just means Baal, means master. So it's one who has control of something. The word husband in Hebrew, Baal, right, is just the one that's in control. Not whatever. Misogyny aside, the Baalat Ov here is a mistress. She is a she, at least gender-wise, grammatically speaking. And she's a mistress of the Ov. Now, we don't know what the Ov is. It seems possible that this word is related to Av and maybe roughly related to the idea of ancestors, specifically dead ancestors. And therefore, we might translate this word as something like the person who has access to the ancestors who are dead, right? Now, that's a really clunky translation. The typical translation we'd use for that now is something like necromancer, right? Necromancy is manipulation of the dead for various kinds of powers, more specifically predicting the future. And that's exactly what we have here with the Baalat Ov. But we don't know what this word Ov means, but I do think it's probably related to the word dead ancestors, these are special people that have access to those dead ancestors. So you may know this story, right? Saul is in a war with the Philistines. King Saul, first king of Israel, is in a war with the Philistines, and it's going badly. Well, not only is it going badly, God has abandoned Saul. Saul goes to the legitimate forms of divination, the Urim and the Thummim. He consults them, and well, God doesn't pick up, right? It's like when I don't know, you're in a big problem, and you call someone and they don't pick up. Well, you freak out. Well, Saul freaks out. So what does he do? He goes to an Ov, right? He goes to one of these people, the Ov, and he consults with this woman. It's a woman character here. And she does successfully summon the ghost, the spirit of the recently deceased prophet Samuel. And she describes Samuel as emerging from the earth as an Elohim, right? She's terrified, in fact. And she says, I see an Elohim coming up from the earth. Now, we do see in other texts, for instance, in Akkadian text and Ugaritic text, where the dead are sometimes referred to as Elim, as gods. In fact, there's a specific word for dead ancestor spirits in Hebrew, the Rephaim, who also seem to be sort of alive in the afterlife in some kind of weird way. Exactly what the Rephaim are is mysterious. In fact, a new monograph just got published on the Israelite conception of the Rephaim, and I am really interested to read it because this is a very mysterious problem. Sometimes the Philistines are referred to Rephaim as giants. This is a really mysterious term in Hebrew. At any rate, the Baalat Ov at Endor does successfully summon the ghost of Samuel, the Ruach of Samuel. And of course, like all prophets, as you probably know, they have bad news because prophets always have bad news. Never go to a prophet to get good news. They don't got any. If you go to the prophet bank and go to the good news section, it's empty. It's all full of bad news. And the bad news is, yes, God has abandoned Saul and he's going to die tomorrow. And guess what happens? God abandons Saul and he dies the next day. In fact, he commits suicide dreadfully on the battlefield. So the Baalat Ov is a clear example of an Israelite narrative where magic works, right? There's no question. The text never says, and the Baalat Ov was full of it, and she was a liar. In fact, it paints her very, very nicely. She's always depicted as preparing food for them, being very conscientious. She even says that when Saul comes to consult with her, that he's outlawed this practice, that she doesn't want to do it. He has to force her to do it at some level, and she obliges him. So the Baalat Ov is nothing like the crooked nose evil witch of Hansel and Gretel tales, right? Inherently malevolent and preying upon people. Saul goes to her. She refuses. He insists. She summons the ghost. And then afterwards, when he's terrified of his impending fate, she tries to comfort him with food and drink out of her own commissary, right? She's a relatively poor person, we can imagine. So the image of the Baalat Ov, and sometimes this term is described as the witch at Endor. I really don't like the translation witch at Endor because the term witch is so loaded in our imaginary that it summons an image of this woman utterly unlike how she's presented in the text. So I think we should call her what the text calls her. We should call her a Baalat Ov because it indicates that she's an expert, right? She's an expert at this, right? And clearly she is. Also, for my Star Wars fans, right, you'll recognize the name Endor. Endor in Hebrew, of course, becomes Endor in Star Wars, and there's a lot of weird Star Wars stuff in the Hebrew Bible in Star Wars. So, anyway. So the Baalat Ov of Endor, it's very clear that the writer of at least that text in the Hebrew Bible clearly believes in the power of the Baalat Ov. We don't learn anything else about her. She comes into the story, she gets a few verses, and then she's gone. We never learn anything else about her. At the same time in the Hebrew Bible, there are a lot of weirdos, right? A lot of weirdos, right? Bible's full of weirdos. The most weird, perhaps, are Elijah and his student Elisha. And these two guys are associated with all kinds of miracles. As you may remember, they're weird prophets from back in the day. They're called Ish Elohim, men of God. It's a weird, specific term for folks who are able to not only do prophecy, but also do miracles. And the only times in the Hebrew Bible where the dead are resurrected are always in relationship to Elijah and Elisha. That's the only time in the Hebrew Bible. That's amazing because the dead being resurrected is a big deal because typically only God has power over life and death, and Elijah and Elisha are both respectively able to resurrect the dead, at least those recently dead. In fact, people can be thrown into a grave and jump out alive. It's really spectacular. By the Second Temple period, Solomon, King Solomon, the son of King David, is also associated heavily with magic, specifically the ability to control demons. Again, remember in the apocalyptic period, angels and demons kind of burst on the scene in a way that they hadn't previously in Israelite literature. And these demons, these sort of supernatural malevolent creatures, or at least quasi-malevolent creatures, can be controlled through various magical means. And one of the magical means that we learn about early on, as early as the Dead Sea Scrolls, by the way, and also Josephus and Philo both recount tales in the first century of the ability of Solomon to control demons. Specifically, demons were used in the construction of the first temple. That's interesting and weird because you have a king of Israel using a bunch of demons to control them, right? Specifically, the demon Asmodeus, who's actually a Persian demon, right? Remember that Zoroastrian connection, right? Ashmedai is a Persian deity, a Persian demon, not an Israelite one, but he's imported into Judaism during the process of the Babylonian exile in the Persian period. So Solomon has the ability, at least early on, at least by the Second Temple period, to manipulate demons. And for folks out there who are interested in magic, you probably already know there's an entire branch in the Western magical tradition called Solomonic magic that carries this idea forward to this day. There are people out there to this day practicing variations of Solomonic magic that survived all the way back from the Second Temple period, that have survived into the Middle Ages until now. I won't say that they're exactly contiguous, but there's at least a tradition of Solomon as having the ability to control demons, specifically in the construction of the first temple. Now, that story doesn't occur at all in the Hebrew Bible. There's no evidence there in the Hebrew Bible, but it does begin to occur around the period of the Second Temple period, in the apocalyptic period. And we see it again as early as things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, where there is an exorcistic psalm attributed to Solomon who can do some demon wrangling. Demon wrangling. Would you go to a demon rodeo? I would go to a demon rodeo. All right. The other place, right, where we also see is in the Galilee. The Galilee in the first temple, in the Second Temple period, was kind of jumping, hopping with weird dudes who could do miracles. You may know Choni the Circle Maker, right? Who is famous. I think this is my partner, Alana Alpert, Rabbi Alana Alpert's favorite rabbi of all time is Choni the Circle Maker, who we had the great privilege at davening at his kever, his tomb in the Galilee. Choni, as you may know, is infamous for forcing God to make it rain, but not make it rain a lot, right? Choni said, I'm going to stand in this circle and I'm going to stand here until God makes it rain. Eventually God made it rain, but God, to punish Choni, made it a torrent. And Choni said, that's too hard, God, turn it down a notch. And God turned it down a notch and made it rain normally, and Choni left his circle. This almost led to the excommunication of Choni, because the idea here was that Choni was using powers to manipulate God. That's a thing. How cool is that? Of course, the other guy that we know from this time period, the famous exorcist and Messiah, you may know of him. His name was Josh, Yeshua of Nazareth, better known as Jesus, although I think calling him Josh would be fine with him. Yeah, his name just is the Aramaic word for Joshua. Of course, Jesus also engaged in a great deal of miracle making, predominantly exorcisms. Jesus, if he were not known as the Messiah and the central chord of Christianity, would probably be known as a pretty famous Jewish exorcist. In fact, the majority of the miracles that he did involved exorcism. Another famous rabbi from this time period, of course, is Hanina ben Dosa. He was famous for a range of supernatural feats, including exorcism, but also teleporting, flying around. Yep, Hanina ben Dosa, according to the Talmud, could teleport and fly around. He also engaged in nightly duels with the queen of the demons. The demons have a queen. They have a king as well. Lilith is the queen and Ashmedai is the king, depending on what text you look at. But Hanina ben Dosa was famous for all kinds of supernatural feats, including engaging with Roman emperors along supernatural lines, as well as great stories in the Talmud about him. Of course, we should also mention Shimon Bar Yochai, who would be famous as the writer, allegedly, of the Sefer Zohar, the central text of Kabbalah. We'll get to that in a few weeks. But of course, Shimon Bar Yochai is also attributed to have committed a great deal of miracles. My famous, of course, is that after hiding from the Romans in a cave for many years, he emerged from the cave and was so disgusted with the impiety of the people around him that fire shot forth from his eyes, and he killed a bunch of people. And he realized that his powers were too strong, and he had to restrain them. and so he retreated back into the cave to wait it out. So we have something like Jewish Superman. Uh, Although the guys I think invented Superman were Jewish, so I don't know. Maybe the laser eye thing they learned in Cheder. I have no idea. I'd like to believe that Superman's laser eyes are attributed to Shimon Bar Yochai, but I'm just going to believe that. I'm just going to go believe that that they are derivative of Shimon Bar Yochai, but I don't think that's true. Bia Machir, of course, is Jesus engaging in the exorcism, his most famous exorcism, the Gerasenes demoniac, who Jesus famously threw into a bunch of pigs and ran them off a cliff. There's a really great anti-colonial read of this exorcism ritual that I think is really important, but that may be a story for another day. Now, you might just think, oh, all this magic stuff is unique to a bunch of weirdos in the Galilee. Jesus and those cats that run around with him. No. Rabbinic literature, the Talmud, is absolutely filled with all kinds of magical practices, including things like adjurations. These are magical incantations to be used against various kinds of demons. There are all kinds of demons in the Talmud. The Talmud is full of demons, specifically disease-causing demons. There are massive lists in the Talmud of lucky and unlucky numbers. One of my favorite discussions in the Talmud is in Pesachim, the tractate about Pesach, where you are told you cannot drink wine in pairs because that attracts demons. And if you drink wine in pairs, right, that can attract demons and that's bad. So why do we do 4? Well, you can't do 4. You have to interrupt every single glass of wine with a unique action that interrupts them, so you're always drinking the wine in odd numbers, 1, 1, 1, 1. Also, by the way, if you've ever wondered why we say on Pesach, welcome to everyone who wants to come, they can come in to eat, we always say that in Aramaic. Why do we say it in Aramaic, not in Hebrew? Well, the rabbis say the demons don't understand Aramaic, but they do understand Hebrew, so we say it in Aramaic so the demons won't get invited into our house to eat our food. I'm not kidding you. That is a belief in Rabbinic Judaism about why we welcome people into our home in Pesach in Aramaic and not in Hebrew, because the demons don't understand Aramaic. I don't know why they don't take a Babel class or a Duolingo class to learn it, but maybe the demons are very busy. Further, the Talmud is filled with astrological speculation. There are amulets and incantations, specifically, for instance, one against blindness. There's a pretty famous one there against blindness. There's also a really famous one where you kind of engage in a duel with the demon, and it causes the demon to blow up if you do it correctly. There are also even the accounts in the Tractate Sanhedrin of the creation of artificial people and animals. These are typically referred to as golems, and we will be spending some time talking about golems here in just a bit with the Sefer Yetzirah. Now, all of that stuff I just mentioned is considered completely allowable in the Talmud. You can do astrology, you can make artificial humanoids, you can banish demons, you can do all kinds of stuff, right? There's a lot of things that look a lot like magic in the rabbinical imagination, but what's really clear is that not everything is allowed. For instance, we read in Pirkei Avot in the Mishnah, right? The more flesh, the more worms, the more possessions, the more worries. The more women, the more witchcraft, the more maidservants, the more uncouthness, and the more servants, the more theft. It's a famous line from Pirkei Avot. But again, the more women or the more wives, the more witchcraft. Of course, this is clearly misogynistic, but we also see here there's still a combination of witchcraft, right? Again, linked with women. And again, what we have here, right? What men do, what rabbis do, summoning demons and making things, that's okay. It's when women do stuff like that. Ugh, that's witchcraft. You see it? The othering, right? When men do it, yeah, we can get by. When women do it, it's witchcraft. And this, again, here's an example of what seems to me patently a form of magic, right? This is from Tractate Gittin in the Babylonian Talmud. Gittin has to do with divorce. The rabbis taught, on coming from a bathroom, a man should not have sex until he's waited long enough to walk half a mile. Why? Because the bathroom demon is with him for that time. And if he does have sex, his children will be epileptic. So we have a theory of epilepsy, not a very good theory of epilepsy, but what's the reason? If you go into the bathroom, there's a bathroom demon. By the way, the bathroom demon features prominently in the Talmud. So the bathroom demon, once you go into the bathroom, they attach themselves to you and they follow you for at least a half a mile. But I guess after a half a mile, they go back to the bathroom. And so if you have sex with the bathroom demon attached to you, then your children may become epileptic. Is that magic? Well, it'll do until magic gets here. Looks like magic to me, right? Superstition, magic, religion, the boundary between all these things is incredibly vague, right? The boundary between all these things is vague. Now, if you're curious about if I'm just listing a couple weird things, I'm listing the least weird things, folks. There are far stranger things in the Babylonian Talmud about demons and magic that I have not mentioned here. And I've done an entire class for the Federation, in fact, 8-week class just on Jewish magic. So you're getting basically the Spark Notes version tonight, but I can guarantee you, if I can fill an 8-week class with Jewish magic, I guarantee you there is a ton in there. So after the time period of the apocalyptic, Jewish magic really goes international. That is to say, Jewish magic leaves Palestine and there is a great deal of magic out there in the world. I may have to speed up a little bit just to make time here, but if I go a little bit over, I hope folks will forgive me. In the early common period, Jewish magic was, Jews were associated with magic, and Jewish magic was heavily syncretistic, which is to say that Egyptian, Roman, Jewish, pagan elements were all muddled together to form a kind of international magical practice, international magical language. And an enormous amount of magical documents and magical devices are attested in the ancient world. These are gathered together in what is typically called the Greek magical papyri, of which there are numerous examples of Jewish magic being practiced in the ancient world, both by Jews, but also non-Jews using Hebrew or using Jewish names for God for their own magical purposes. Why? Because they thought that Jews and the Jewish God had some kind of special magical power. This is just a small gathering of some of the magical devices that are definitely associated with Jews that have survived from the ancient and late classical world. So you can see here we have love spells, right? You would cast this into a fire to form a love spell. You see a Defixiones, right? Defixiones is a curse tablet here written upon in metal that would be used to curse people. You see amulets here that invoke angels, right, to protect you from various kinds of spirits. You see a curse here on the left-hand side, written on papyrus that is survived from the late classical period, early medieval period. And perhaps most shockingly, you can see one of the 3 skull devices that have been found with Hebrew incantations written on the skull of a dead person. The skull incantations we have, I can pull that up for you later if you really want to read the entire incantation. But 3 of these skull incantations have been found throughout the ancient and late classical world. And these skull incantations are something that most Jews would be shocked by. The touching of a dead body to do anything at all is completely unimaginable. The use of a skull to write an incantation on to harness some kind of magical powers would fill many ancient Jews with shock and disgust. And yet, there's no denying that all these forms of magic were being practiced by Jews in the ancient world. And I say all of these practices, if you look at Roman, Greek, Egyptian, other practices in the ancient world, you will find the exact same forms of magic being practiced by them. Lead tablets, magical amulets. The skull thing is kind of weird, but magic love spells, right? In fact, you cast this into a fire and it says, if as this burns, may the heart of Rachel burn for me. We even have Rachel's name written on there. We don't know who Rachel it was, but some Rachel. Pick a Rachel, any Rachel. But also we have named people here in this curse as well. So needless to say, right, just looking at this on the screen, people who say Jews don't practice magic, that's not a thing we do. Well, you got some archaeology to deal with. Like, really? Like, you got archaeology to deal with. There's a lot of this going on, right? And again, this is just what survived. If this what survived, you can imagine how much there was. You can imagine there must have been a ton of this going on. In fact, what's great about this one here is that there are spaces left for the names to be put in, which meant this was made commercially, right? So this device was made commercially, and then the magical practitioner would go in and add the names in later to kind of make it work. This is being sold. This was a commercial object you could buy in the shuk or whatever in the market from a ritual expert, and they would cause people to curse people or cause people to flourish or whatever. A very popular form of Jewish magic in the ancient world, but also a popular form of Christian, Mandean, and pagan magic was incantation bowls. Incantation bowls were bowls with images typically of demons. Some of our earliest depictions of the demoness Lilith are found in these incantation bowls. They would be, you would draw an image of the demon that you want to bind. You can see that these demons here are bound with chains. You can see that their hands are tied here, or they're bound with chains. And then an incantation will be written around the periphery of the inside of the bowl. And then the bowl would be buried upside down, right, concave part down in the doorway of your house. And the idea is any demon coming in would be captured by the bowl, right? This is sort of like a glue trap like you would use on a mouse. Don't use glue traps on mice. That's really, really cruel. But kind of like a glue trap, but for demons. For demons. So these bowls were meant to trap evil spirits from entering your home by turning them upside down and burying them in the lintel of your home. Of course, mezuzot are used for the exact same purposes. In many cases where there's a terrible illness in a home, still to this day in the Haredi world, the rabbi will ask to check the mezuzahs to make sure they are in order, to make sure that evil spirits didn't enter the home because of a faulty mezuzah. By the way, this demon bowl right here, if you ever get down to the Kelsey Museum in Ann Arbor, you can see this exact bowl. This is in Ann Arbor at the Kelsey Museum on display. There's an excellent little museum there, but you can see this exact incantation bowl for my Michigan people. Get down, go to the Kelsey Museum, see the incantation bowl. You may notice here, this is just a lot of wiggles. You're right, it's a bunch of wiggles, but it's wiggles that look like Hebrew, vaguely. Well, not everyone can read. So if you couldn't read, you might get the wiggle bowl. But if you could read, you would get the real incantation bowl with the real incantation written around it. So we have these illiterate bowls, right, that are written with pseudoscript. And by the way, we can always tell who these are meant for because the Aramaic ones are always for Jews, the Mandean ones are the Mandeans, the other ones are for Christians or whatever. So everyone was using these. There are thousands of these. If you get your chance to go to the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, they have one of the largest collections of these demon bowls in the world. They have a whole wall of them. So if you really want to get your fill of demon bowls, go to the Royal Ontario Museum and see them. I also say that one day, if we ever do Techia Arts and Crafts for the little kids, if they're going to do like Play-Doh, they should make demon bowls. It's like a completely authentic Bubbies and Baka day. If they're going to make anything, let them make the little demon bowls and paint the inside with monsters or whatever. It's a great way for them to put that under their bed to like deal with their fear of monsters. I feel like this is an authentically Jewish way of dealing with fears about monsters and demons by allowing kiddos to make these bowls and maybe have a bit of catharsis in trapping the demons in the bowls. So anyone who says again that Jews don't do magic, well, I got 10,000 demon incantation bowls that you got to deal with. Just as a bit of wrapping up, folks, I want to go through these a little more rapidly. We're coming close to time. Another text that begins to emerge at this time are exactly books of magic, right? Books that we might call grimoires. These are books of magic. One of the more famous, very early ones is called the Sefer HaRazim. I've done episodes on my Esoterica channel on almost all of these books. So if you really want to dig deep into some of these books of magic, almost all of these I've covered in depth, 20-minute episodes or so on my channel. So we have this as a book called the Sefer HaRazim that was recovered in fragments in the Cairo Geniza. It dates to around the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries. It could be perhaps earlier. And this system uses an elaborate system of angel magic and magical symbols. These magical symbols here we'll see all throughout Jewish magic to use those magic to get what you want, whether it's winning horse races or gaining love or turning invisible or whatever. The Sefer HaRazim has a spell for you, and it uses these various magical, it manipulates angels by using various kinds of magical symbols to get them to do what you want. Remember, the Sar Torah literature does something similar. It allows you to rapidly learn rabbinic lore. Here we're having it used to do a lot more wider things, including things like turning invisible and healing people of sicknesses, and also cursing people with sicknesses, because who doesn't get salty sometimes? Another famous text from around the 10th century is the Charba de Moshe. This is an Aramaic magical book that uses a first section, which are long strings of Hebrew or Aramaic letters, and then you would extract out of those long strings Hebrew Aramaic letters certain sections. I've highlighted a section here that you would use for doing various things, and you would use those sections along with a magical spell, and those magical spells would empower those code words, and those code words would do all kinds of various things like turning invisible and making people fall in love with you, cursing people and turning invisible, the same kinds of things that most magical spell books actually do. They're pretty repetitive once you get into them. So this one's interesting because the Sword of Moses is that long list of seemingly random Hebrew letters, which are then extracted out and then used for magical purposes that I mentioned earlier. So the sword is actually what is going on to be used. Some of these magical words also show up later in Christian magical texts, which means that Christians were so interested in Jewish magic that they had the Jews translate some of it for them so that they could use the magical power as well, and then convict the Jews of witchcraft and kill them. But hey, history, dangerous place. Some of the famous texts, right, are the Sefer HaYashar and the Sefer HaMalbush. The Sefer HaYashar is a text of astrological Jewish magic that tells you how specifically to do magic on certain kinds of days so that you can focus your magical power using astrology. Again, anyone who says that ancient Jews don't do astrology, well, again, I got some text for you to deal with. Of course they did. Everyone did astrology. So we have a magical text that uses magic, angel magic, and astrology to manipulate various forces in the cosmos to accomplish various ends. And of course, we have the Sefer HaMalbush, which allows one to make a special kind of cloak or garment inscribed upon with various magical names of God that allow you to do all kinds of things. For instance, summon an invisible army, which who doesn't want to 7-nation army, whatever, right? Your Jack White quote, miles may vary, right? But you can use the Sefer, the Malbush, the garment, to do all kinds of magical things, and you write upon this garment with various kinds of magical names of God, and you fast and sort of things as well in order to enact the magical power. I picked this image out, by the way, FYI, because this is an image of a Jew from the Middle Ages, and notice he's also forced to wear a yellow device, but notice it's a yellow circle as opposed to a yellow star. So this, I just find this image interesting because he's forced to wear an identifying marker, but it's not the star of later periods, it's the circle. This is also in Germany, a sort of horrifying harbinger of things to come. Perhaps the most famous book of Jewish magic in history is the Sefer Raziel HaMalach, the book of the angel Raziel. Raziel, of course, is a name that means the secrets of God. This is actually a collection of various books, including the Sefer HaMalbush. It's still printed to this day. In fact, I have a copy right behind me. This book is actually printed in very, very tiny little editions, so you can carry it around in your house or put it in your car. And even the book itself is said to have magical powers even to this day. You're looking at an image here of some magical angelic script from the Sefer Raziel. These devices are meant to allow you, these are kamayot or amulets, which guarantee you various things like success or defense from magical evil powers. So again, here we have magical devices, and these magical symbols, by the way, date back all the way, some of them all the way to the Greek magical papyri of the first centuries of the Common Era. So this is a 2,000-year long process of the practice of Jewish magic. This famous edition was printed in 1701 in Amsterdam, but like I said, it continues to be printed all the way to this day. In fact, I have an entire copy printed on one piece of microfilm, because the idea is as long as you have a copy of the book, even if it's just on microfilm, then the book still has magical power. Then I have an entire copy on microfilm downstairs with the Sfarim. So this book, the Sefer Raziel HaMalach, is said to have power even just having it. In fact, I have several copies lying around. And so here again, we can see these magical images, and this idea of this magical script continues to be used all the way down to this day in modern occultism. It occurred most famously, of course, in the 1530s edition of Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, and it continues to be reprinted in modern books of witchcraft. Modern witches continue to use these magical images all the way down to this day. Jewish magic is alive and well. If you go into Haredi bookstores, you will find books on Kamayot and Segulot, books on amulets, books on magical psalms to recite for various magical powers. You can find all kinds of books in the most extremely orthodox communities you want to go. I go into Brooklyn and Borough Park. I go into the very, very extreme Orthodox Jewish bookstores because I can blend in. And I go in their bookstores and I look through the shelves and I find books of magic. There are books of magic about how to make amulets, books of astrology, Sefer Mazalot. Uh, in the Haredi world, magic, Jewish magic, is alive and well today. New books are being written on Jewish magic, and those books are being practiced all the way down till now. It also survives in the liberal Jewish world, for instance, in the Kohenet movement. The Kohenet movement, as you may know, is a revivalist, sort of quasi-pagan Jewish revivalist movement that wants to resurrect the idea of a Jewish priestesshood, and magical practices in that world are also incredibly popular. And so in that world, in the most sort of radical left-wing Jewish world, magic is also being practiced. So we have the most radical left-wing world of Jewish practice, magical practice happening over there at the Isabella Freeman Center, right? All the way to B'nai Brak, where they are publishing books of magic, Jewish magic in the Haredi world. Jewish magic's alive and well, folks. It never went away. It's always been there, right? It's always been there. How do we know? Because the Bible has to condemn it. Condemnations are always proof of practice. It was being practiced by Israelites. That's why they condemned it. Well, it didn't work. The prohibition almost certainly made sure that it would continue to be practiced. It's been practiced all through time. The earliest part of the Hebrew Bible we have is probably a magical amulet. We have evidence of Jewish magic reaching back to extreme antiquity, to the very beginning of the Israelites. And we have evidence of it being practiced in the Haredi Black Hat world and in the leftist Jewish world of the Kohenet movement. Jewish magic has always been here, it is here, and it will endure. It will no doubt endure. I have some recommendations if you want to learn more about Jewish magic, especially ancient Jewish magic. There are some of these great books by Bohak and Hariri. The Hariri text, by the way, is published by Wayne State Publishers. So shout out to Wayne State Publishing here just down the street from me. So if you want to take a look at those books, I can't say they're terribly inexpensive, but they're really high quality scholarship. And if you want to learn more about the history of Jewish magic up until the rise of the Kabbalah, those are both excellent texts to consult. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work of providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and the occult, along with magic and Hermetic philosophy, consider supporting my work on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.